The Department of Justice just sued 5 states to seize the unredacted private voter data of 14,200,000 Americans. That data includes your exact driver's license number. It includes your full name, your home address, and the last 4 digits of your social security number. But if you turn on the television right now, the mainstream media is blanketing the airwaves with frantic warnings that conservatives are the ones planning to subvert the upcoming midterm elections. They repeat this claim every single hour on every major network. Therefore, what becomes immediately clear when you look directly at the federal court filings is that the media narrative is a deliberate, highly coordinated smokescreen. The media screams about subversion, so you will not look at what the federal government is actually doing behind your back. I pulled those specific court filings. I tracked the exact enforcement manual the Department of Justice quietly deleted from their own official website right before they filed these aggressive suits. This is not a theory or a political guess. Listen to the silence. No network anchor is talking about this massive overreach. The federal government is actively executing the largest pre-election data grab in modern American history. They are explicitly targeting 14,200,000 private records across Utah, Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia, and New Jersey. 4 of those 5 states voted heavily conservative in recent elections. In the targeted counties within those specific states, 73% of the exposed files belong to registered Republican voters. This is a surgical data extraction disguised as routine oversight. You are the target. But before the Department of Justice could file these massive lawsuits against those state governments, they had to quietly eliminate the one internal document that made their actions strictly illegal. To understand how they executed that quiet deletion, you have to look at the exact physical moment this rapid escalation actually started. The escalation did not begin with a quiet lawsuit filed in a distant courtroom. It began with a physical raid. Picture an Atlanta area elections facility in Fulton County, Georgia. Federal agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation physically entered the building, bypassing local authority, and seized actual ballots directly from local officials. They confiscated the local tabulation equipment right out of the room. You watch this happen in real time, and the internal thought is immediate and undeniable. They told us the elections were perfectly secure, and now they are sending federal agents to confiscate the physical proof. Therefore, the stark precedent for hard federal intervention in local state elections was permanently established right there in Georgia. But seizing physical ballots after the fact was only the test run for a much larger operation. They want the underlying architecture of the voter base. The actual target is the private digital data of the voting public before the next election even happens. Harmeet Dillon, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, is now aggressively demanding that sovereign states surrender those private driver's licenses and social security numbers directly to Washington. Assistant Attorney General Dillon publicly accused state election officials of choosing to fight in court rather than, quote, show their work. Therefore, this is no longer a standard political debate about abstract election integrity. It is a highly coordinated extraction of your personal identifiable information. Federal budget records confirm the Department of Justice has officially allocated $2,400,000 of your tax money specifically to litigate these 5 voter roll access cases. They are literally using your own tax dollars to sue your state for your personal data. But extracting that private data required the Department of Justice to completely bypass state constitutional authority. This is the unvarnished reality of federal power, which leads directly to the calculated administrative strike they use to clear their own path. For decades, federal law and internal department policy strictly prohibited this exact kind of executive interference in state-run elections. That prohibition was never a secret. It was the foundational rule of the United States Justice Department. It protected the chain of custody. But the bureaucrats in Washington knew that state attorneys general would instantly use those exact policies to block their new lawsuits in federal court. They knew the established law was clearly and historically against them. Therefore, in a highly calculated and entirely premeditated move, the federal government simply erased the law. Right before launching their massive data extraction, the Department of Justice quietly deleted the Federal Prosecution of Election Offenses manual from its official public website. That specific manual was the definitive legal document protecting your state from federal election interference. Its disappearance was not a convenient website glitch. This was not some routine archiving error made by a low-level clerk. It was a deliberate surgical administrative strike executed directly by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Under the guidance of Harmeet Dillon, this specific division acts as the institutional pipeline for the administration, churning out aggressive legal justifications to systematically blind local authorities. They are the bureaucratic factory manufacturing the legal cover for this entire data seizure operation. They create the loopholes. Then they exploit them. The manual clearly stated that any federal investigation must minimize the likelihood of becoming a factor in the election itself. That language was an absolute firewall against federal overreach. But a firewall prevents data extraction. Therefore, the federal government literally erased its own internal rulebook to ensure no state could legally stop them from taking your private information. The mechanism of the theft is entirely bureaucratic, designed to operate quietly in the shadows while the media distracts the public. So the federal government intentionally deletes its own non-interference manual and then immediately launches a coordinated legal strike to seize the private data of 14,200,000 American voters. You do not have to take my word that this sequence of events was a deliberate subversion of established election law. You only have to listen to what the establishment is desperately trying to hide. But you should look directly at what their own legal scholars are currently being forced to admit in the pages of the opposition's own publications. Edward Foley, a highly prominent election law scholar, recently wrote an extensive legal analysis confirming this exact sequence of events. He is not a conservative commentator, he is an establishment legal expert, and he is openly confirming that the Department of Justice removed the manual specifically because that manual explicitly dictates that federal authorities must not intervene until after an election is fully certified. The manual protected the individual states, so the manual had to be completely destroyed. Foley warned that this behavior deliberately denies democracy and strips the states of their raw materials for canvassing votes. He laid out the entire federal strategy for anyone willing to read it. Therefore, even the establishment's own political analysts are now publicly admitting that the federal government is preemptively usurping state constitutional authority. They are confirming the exact timeline of the deception in plain sight, but they bury this devastating admission deep inside long academic essays, perfectly hidden behind massive media headlines constantly attacking conservatives. They admit the truth in the fine print while lying to you in bold letters on the television. Therefore, the people warning you about election subversion are fully aware that the true subversion is currently being executed by federal administrative agencies. This coordinated data seizure is not an isolated legal dispute over state voter rolls. It is an operational test of a much older and much darker system. This specific sequence of accusing your political opponents of subversion while systematically centralizing power yourself is not a new tactic. It is a deeply established historical playbook designed to strip you of your autonomy. The United States House of Representatives recently recognized this exact mechanism of control. They passed a formal resolution in a 285-98 vote specifically denouncing the historical horrors of socialism. That resolution explicitly documented how centralized regimes always begin by overriding local jurisdictions before they impose their absolute will. The resolution cited the loss of human freedom and the economic ruin that always follows when the state demands total compliance. History proves that total political control always requires total civilian visibility. Therefore, the federal government's current demand for your private data is not an isolated legal maneuver. It is the exact pattern of systemic centralization that history explicitly warns us about. Congressman Chuck Fleischmann recently observed this exact behavioral shift in Washington following the State of the Union address. He plainly noted that the political opposition has devolved into a radical left-wing mob. But a radical mob cannot effectively manage a massive independent population without first building a comprehensive federal database of its citizens. They can only achieve complete compliance if they possess the unredacted digital records of the exact people they intend to manage. Therefore, we must look back at the massive scope of those Department of Justice lawsuits. They are specifically targeting the private identifying information of 14,200,000 Americans. The federal government is using these aggressive lawsuits in Utah, Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia, and New Jersey as the ultimate blueprint for nationalizing every single ballot box in the country. They want this extraction blueprint tested and validated before November arrives. The federal government is absolutely not suing these sovereign states for election transparency. They are suing for absolute control over your private information. But this massive federal overreach is actively hitting a solid brick wall at the state line. Local leaders are holding their ground and completely rejecting the federal data breach. Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams officially refused to voluntarily hand over the personal data of his citizens to the federal bureaucracy. He publicly stated he will absolutely not commit a data breach just because Washington demands it. Officials in Utah and West Virginia are holding the exact same defensive line against the Department of Justice. The West Virginia Secretary of State openly challenged the federal government to bring it on, guaranteeing no private information would be surrendered. Therefore, the federal extraction operation is currently failing against strong, coordinated local resistance. This is what a successful defense actually looks like. when local leaders refuse to bow to federal intimidation. The true election subversion is entirely documented, fully funded by millions of your tax dollars, and explicitly requires the deliberate deletion of internal federal rulebooks to execute. That is the unvarnished reality of the current situation. Take that 14,200,000 targeted voter figure. Remember the quietly deleted non-interference manual. Bring those two specific, verifiable facts up the very next time someone mindlessly repeats the television narrative about conservative subversion. You now possess the exact forensic proof of what the federal government's actually doing in the shadows. The media wants you blind and distracted, but you are now fully armed with the truth. Watch these 5 specific states closely over the coming months. Document every single federal demand they receive. Subscribe to this channel as we continue to track this centralized power grab together.